the well-being of the system that the brain is trying to protect. So there's a chemistry that allows memory to be suppressed. Under the right circumstances, if you go to the Yale Holocaust Video Archive, or in some measure the Spielberg Shoah Foundation Archive, you will find testimony that has been created by people with background and training in the Holocaust period who know to create a safe environment. And in that safe, comfortable environment, in the mind of a survivor, memory is resuscitated, memory comes back. And they'll begin to talk about the hard times they've been through. Initially, they might talk about, you know, that person did this or went through that, as though it was someone else's life. But eventually, as they're comfortable, I remember this. And you'll see in their face also that the memory is returning and those divided selves begin to combine. The yogic path, the Krishna conscious path, is one of also a return of suppressed memory, the memory of ourselves as eternal beings. The original trauma, if you will, being the soul's entrance into the material world. So there are things like that that can be pointed to in a presentation about the Holocaust. We'll look at a film clip like the Robert Redford, Mia Farrow, Great Gatsby, as an example of the verse from Bhagavad Gita that talks about becoming preoccupied with material acquisition. All right, Gatsby's probably the primal example of someone who's become so obsessed with achieving worldly acclaim that ultimately he loses his life over it. And sometimes we will, you want to, where are we now? Okay, Path of Rama. We were ahead a bit here. Okay. When you do the Ramayana, you have all kinds of opportunities: music, dance, art, philosophy, drama. There's all kinds of ways that the Ramayana can be brought to life. You can schedule a whole week just around the Ramayana. Peter Brook, back in 1986, created an 8-hour staged version of Mahabharata, and it's available on DVD. It's more about Peter Brook than Vyasadeva, but it's still a worthy accomplishment. And for people who are trying to get a handle on the Bhagavad Gita, it's an important way of explaining, for instance, how the Bhagavad Gita does not espouse war. That's a big misunderstanding. It's one of the conundra that people confront when they study Bhagavad Gita. How can a wisdom text, something that at least 12 places in the Gita exalts ahimsa as the most noble of human qualities, end in encouraging a soldier to kill? People don't get that. Well, if you study the Mahabharata, you learn that warfare was the last option, not the first. The Pandavas went through every other possible way of diffusing the conflict between themselves and the Kauravas. Mediation, threats of sanction, even at one point giving them the kingdom. And the Kauravas were so envious. Their response was, "We will not give you enough land in which to drive the head of a pin." And at that point, war became inevitable. So, you know, for an old hippie like me, it took a while to wrap my arms around the idea that there's a right way to conduct war. But in Bhagavad Gita, specifically by referencing the larger context, the Mahabharata story, those kinds of points can be made. So that's a very effective way of introducing that. We bring artists to talk about art as an aesthetic expression of devotion and how a painting can become worshipable. How does a painting become something, an incarnation of God? You know, how does that happen? What's the concept behind that? So when you have such talented artists as Dhriti and Ramdas, who were guests at Jivamukti Yoga a few years back, that can be brought to the surface. Kirtan, of course, is a whole world in itself these days. And here's one other really wonderful way of engaging people. There's a wildlife preserve in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, run by a dear friend of mine named Bhagavan Antle. Doc Antle is a disciple of Swami Satchidananda, and he uses yoga techniques for communing with the largest community of rare and endangered tigers in the world. He's got 55 acres down there. There are more than 90 tigers. We're talking gorgeous, gorgeous creatures. And you get up, they don't believe in bars and cages there. You get up close, you get to hold baby tigers, baby pumas, leopards, lynxes. I mean, the most extraordinary creations of nature. And seeing consciousness at work in other than human form is the most extraordinary experience. I cannot begin to tell you. There was one time, I've been down there 15, 20 times. We've done books of interspecies friendships. What happens when you have otherwise predatory animals like a lion or a tiger living in an environment like the Myrtle Beach Preserve, their predatory nature abates and other facets of behavior and character rise to the surface. Curiosity, root for relationships with humans, interspecies friendships. So you have, as you can see lower left, for example, if you go online on YouTube and do a search for orangutan and dog, you will find one of the most popular friendships online. There's a video clip there that's had more than 100 million hits. 100 million. That's how powerful that idea of interspecies friendship becomes. Here's a shot, for example, from the Tigers Preserve in Myrtle Beach. Here's another one that I'm particularly fond of. I mean, it's absolutely amazing to interact. These are memories that are quickly fading into history because a lot of these species won't be around much longer. This is a beautiful shot right there. Animals are capable of such extraordinary emotion. You know, we're just this close away, genetically and spiritually, from many species. And particularly in Krishna consciousness, where we're attempting to foster an appreciation for life in all of its many diverse forms. A trip to the Wildlife Preserve in Myrtle Beach is a memorable, life-changing experience. And we've done that 3 times now with groups from Jivamukti Yoga and the Bhakti Center in New York. So those are just an idea of some ways that you can get people involved. We do other things. We go to theater. We go to museums. And I'll say people, okay, now from your studies of Bhagavad Gita, looking at this painting by Matisse, describe for me what you're seeing from a Vedic point of view, a Vaishnava point of view. What are you seeing? Very, very interesting to just kind of put people in that persona and allow them to visualize and imagine what it would be like to live and view things as a devotee. So that's a little bit of background to different ways that we're working in New York to present Krishna consciousness. So what you're about to hear is not the story arc of the book. I'll describe some of that toward the end, but this is more about how I would present Prabhupada to a non-informed, non-devotee audience. Okay, so if you do the next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, in courses at Hofstra, I'll very often talk about the monomyth model. Now, some of you may be familiar with Joseph Campbell, the late mythologist, and the work that he did in studying the similarities between the great epic stories in world cultures. Campbell, going back to the 1940s, when his very famous book, Hero with 1,000 Faces, was published in 1949, traveled the world comparing great epic stories, the great myths, the great fables, the great religious stories. And what he found was that there are patterns that seem to repeat throughout history, throughout cultures, and between peoples who may have had absolutely no contact with one another before. There are similarities that unite people. And I find it absolutely fascinating because if you look at that, it says something about the journey to Krishna. It says something about our hero journey as well in Krishna consciousness. So I found it an interesting point of comparison. Okay, what is the monomyth? What Campbell calls the monomyth, or the one great myth that seems to link cultures around the world. It's the story of each of us as individuals who leave a dark place, the everyday world, the common world, and, if you will, the Maya world, and we journey, we set out on an adventure, on a journey towards some other place. And along the way, the hero, Campbell calls the protagonist in the monomyth the hero. The hero is all of us. The hero's confronting crises and obstacles along the way and has to overcome those obstacles and achieve a great victory. And if the victory can be achieved, there's a boon that is finally attained. In some cultures, it's the treasure that's being held in a cave, protected by a great dragon, all right? Or in other cultures, in Bible stories, it's the search for the golden fleece or the Holy Grail in Arthurian legends. So in many ways, it's a hero, as you read here, venturing forth from the world of common day into a region of supernatural wonder. The hero returns from this mysterious adventure with the power to bestow boons on his fellow man. Next slide, please. This is a simple schemata of what the monomyth journey looks like. There's a call to adventure. And here's what's interesting about this particular first stage in the monomyth. Every one of us here has been called to adventure. We've gone through that stage already. We were living a life before, and something happened. It usually has to do with meeting what Campbell calls the supernatural aid, or the mentor, or we would say the spiritual master, someone who changes life irrevocably for us. And we're embarking now on this, we're crossing a threshold from the known world into the unknown world. And French sociologist Émile Durkheim describes what happens when you cross over from the life you've known into a different life. It's called anomie. Very interesting word. A-N-O-M-I-E. Anomie. Anomie refers to the sense of displacement you feel when you leave a life that you've known. You understand the circumstances, you understand the behavior that's expected of you, what are the rules and protocols, and you're put into another environment where you don't know anymore what's expected, you don't know what the rules are, and you're feeling adrift. So that's what happens initially on that hero journey. By the way, this model can get a little bit more complex. Next slide, please, Dhruva. As you can see, and it goes on and on and on. There's details within details within details. And it's extraordinary how similar the great stories of the world reflect this monomyth model. Now, Campbell admitted that it's not an absolute template. It's not that everyone follows exactly these same protocols, but there are certain basic steps that are the same. Next slide, please. There's the ordinary world. And then there's the call to adventure, which is often prompted by meeting a mentor. There's a road of trials, and those trials usually come in threes. I'm not exactly sure why. I've thought about it. Maybe the first time you mess up and you just don't know what to do. The second time you get a little bit better sense of your footing. And then the third time you get it right. Or if you look at Hanuman's leap across the ocean to Lanka, there were 3 challenges that he had to confront there. So these things somehow, they come in threes. Then there's the crossing of the threshold, going into a new realm, a different realm, a supernatural world. I call it the Swami in a strange land, right? But it's going into a place that you've never been to. Nothing like it has ever crossed your path before. And in that strange world, you face an ordeal, which Campbell calls the belly of the whale, which of course is the reference to Jonah, where there was no turning back. There's no turning back. Life is irrevocably changed. And at that point, there are only 2 options. You either transform or you die. You either die a physical death or you die a psychic death. So each of us, as we confront that moment in our Krishna conscious lives, we either transform or we die, meaning a death to our spiritual life, if you will. You know, we've known people who have gone away from Krishna consciousness. right? And where are they? You know, it's tragic. You know, you don't know why they would have gone back to that. It's a kind of spiritual death. If you're able to overcome that moment of irrevocable change of life circumstances, then you have the opportunity of achieving the boon, understanding the knowledge in Prabhupada's books, getting that light of our own souls, retrieving our own souls, and bringing that back into the world. Now, not everybody does that. Not everybody becomes a global acharya. You know, some people say, oh, wow, I finally get it. I'm not my body. Krishna is the supreme personality of Godhead. I'm out of here. You know, and they're in Vrindavan or wherever, and you never hear from them again. And that's fine. You know, that for some people, that's the absolute right answer. But for some people, the option is to come back and bring that light to others, which is what Campbell calls the application of the boon. If you've ever seen any of the movies here up on the screen, I know we don't watch movies, but if by accident you've seen any of these movies, you are completely familiar with the monomyth model. Hollywood loves the monomyth, absolutely adores the monomyth. There was a screenwriter named Christopher Vogler back in the mid-'80s who wrote a book called The Writer's Journey. And it's a guidebook for screenwriters. And it's completely based on the Campbell model of this, you know, arc, the story arc, going from dark to light, from not knowing to knowing. Let's think of Arjuna. Inaction to action, etc. So all of these stories follow that. And again, this pattern is repeated across cultures. The life of Jesus, not to compare the life of Jesus with a Hollywood film, but the life of Jesus is also a monomyth study, as was the life of the Buddha and the Prophet Muhammad. All went through a type of journey to bring light into the world. Thank you. Here you see, if you're a fan of Lord of the Rings, or here you see Jason and the Argonauts, or you know, the trial of Odysseus. It's there in the Iliad and the Odyssey when Odysseus is trying to get home after the Trojan Wars. Or it's there in Ahab's quest for the great whale Moby Dick. And if you go to the next slide, in the novel Jane Eyre, Charlotte Bronte brings readers into the emotions and experiences of the title character, including Jane's growth into adulthood and the gradual unfolding of her moral and spiritual sensibility. That's also a kind of hero journey. Next slide, please. It's there in the freedom marches of the 60s, embedded in the civil rights movement. I have a dream. After all, what is the monomyth, the following of our path to self-awareness, if not the pursuit of a dream? And we do tend to impose these expectations on our political leaders as well. Here you see Obama won Kenobi with his healthcare lightsaber. And for me, the question was, I was kind of uncomfortable with the idea of the word monomyth applied to Krishna consciousness. I mean, you don't want to say mythology is applied to Krishna consciousness. So I did go back to the Vedic stories. And if you look at the Bhagavatam and you study the lives of the great sages and saints, Prahlad, if you look at the life of Dhruva, if you look at the life of Narada, of Jadbharat, if you study the story, of course, the Pandavas, they've all gone through similar kinds of journeys where from the everyday world they've embarked on some arduous path to their unfolding, to their fulfillment as representatives of God in the world. Right? And of course, for all of us, if we look at the lives of the Acharyas, it's there in the life of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati and his father Bhaktivinoda Thakur, the journeys that they took to bring Krishna consciousness into the general public, the achieving of the boon and the bringing of that boon, that light back into the world. And for all of us, of course, it's there. The greatest adventure of all is initiation into Krishna consciousness. And there's one line from Campbell that I'm very fond of. It comes to mind because we all had plans before. We all had ideas about what our life might be, right? Campbell says we must let go of the life we have planned so as to accept the one that is waiting for us. And that's worth contemplating. You know, the idea that we have these expectations. We'd like to think that we live in a world where goodness is rewarded. If we behave a certain way, this is going to happen as a result. Well, those images, those illusions have been shattered time and time again. And so to let go of those plans, this is what I want, this is where I'll be comfortable. From this position I can surrender, you know, kind of. And embrace a life that is uncertain. It's not clear right now. For me, in my studies of Bhagavad Gita, that's been a really tough love kind of revelation, is that Krishna consciousness is not a guarantee that your life is going to be like this or like that. Rather, it's acquiring the tools that allow us to process uncertainty more effectively. The ability to go out into a world where you cannot count on the outcome of events, and with that core conviction that I'm okay, I'm an eternal soul, Prabhupada is looking out for me. To my mind, that's the hero journey that we've embarked upon. So I looked in the Gita and said, you don't find the word monomyth, but you do find the word sacrifice. And that's really what all of these different journeys are. It's a sacrifice. It's a giving up of something in order to move forward toward fulfillment and self-awareness. And of course, ultimately, the command in Bhagavad Gita, stand and fight, you know, which is, I guess, kind of the theme song for the monomyth, you know. Get over yourself already, you know. Enough lamenting about the path. Yeah, it was tough stuff, and you're bitter about it, and that's okay. That's reasonable. You have every reason to feel bitter about the past. You're going to live there? Is that where you're going to live? Right? So get up, get over yourself, and get going. Right? That's the compulsion of that monomyth model. And of course, the greatest monomyth of modern times, Star Wars. Oh, excuse me. Wait a minute. That's not Star Wars. That's the Ramayana. And I was thinking of the Ramayana. Wait a minute. That's not the Ramayana. That's Star Wars. Why am I getting so confused? Well, maybe it's because these two stories are actually one and the same. Next slide, please. George Lucas invited Joe Campbell to live at Lucas Ranch when he was writing the scripts for Star Wars back in the 70s. And as Lucas is creating the narrative structure to the Star Wars, the biggest franchise in film history, you know, you can't even count how much money Lucas is. He's got all the money in the world. You can't find anything more to give him. He's hearing the Ramayana from Joseph Campbell. Let me walk you through this. Next slide, please, Dhruva. All right. There is, in both stories, this dark lord who wants to take over the universe. Next slide. And there's this beautiful princess whom the Dark Lord kidnaps, right? And then the Dark Lord holds the princess captive in his fortress until a young hero sets out to rescue the princess and find her. And he does so with the help of a mystic wise teacher who instructs the prince how to use mystic weaponry that will help him to rescue the princess. And there is this monkey-like creature who helps the prince to rescue the princess. And there's also this feisty older brother type person who helps the prince to rescue the princess. And the hero wages a great battle against the Dark Lord. And in the forces of this battle, there are these big giant things that the prince has to fight and conquer. And finally, he wins the battle with the help of an army of monkey and bear-like creatures. Right? And then at the end of this great battle, there is a coronation where the princess and the prince return to their capital, and there's a grand ceremony, and harmony is restored to the universe. Now, devotees would say this is obviously the Ramayana. The rest of the world would say this is obviously Star Wars. Right? So it's to say that this monomyth model holds true for most great journeys. So now let's take a look at Srila Prabhupada's hero journey. When I set out to write this book, and it was with the blessings of my godbrothers and godsisters, and I was thinking, what are the things that I would like readers to take away? I had 5 objectives. Does anyone have a copy of the book, by the way? I'd like to read from it if there's one around. The objectives were, first of all, it's a vehicle for Prabhupada's teachings. Yeah, I asked, what would Prabhupada say to me if I told him I want to write a biography? He'd say, well, just use it as a vehicle for the teachings. Teach people about Krishna consciousness. So the first thing I was hoping readers would walk away with is a sense that they're not their body. I'm not my body. Okay, got to think about that. The second thing I was hoping is that they would say, God is a person. All right, got to think about that. The third thing I was hoping they would say is, all right, now I get what a real guru is. Now I get what a real spiritual master is. And the fourth thing I was hoping was that they would say, I'm involved in this somehow. This isn't just reading somebody else's biography. He came for me. I'm in this story somehow. And of course, the home run would have been, the fifth thing is, I think I'd like to read some of his books. So those were the goals for me, I was hoping. So here we have, it's early 1900s Calcutta, the capital of the British colonial India. Here's what we might call the ordinary world. Thank you very much. And there are some European sympathizers, but the majority of the British are looking down upon the natives as heathens who must come up to the light of Christianity if they're ever going to be saved from their uncivilized ways. And there's this growing hostility toward the British, who are looking down on the natives with such disdain. What do you think the greatest objection was by the Europeans, the colonists in India? What do you think the single biggest objection was by European colonial missionaries and intellectuals and others? Single biggest objection. Culture. What else? Polytheism. Specifically, you're closer. Specifically, deities. The one thing that they could not tolerate was the idea of idol worship. Right? If let's see the next one. If you hear, for example, a quote from one missionary, "Whatever plausible argument may be advanced for image worship, we believe if history teaches anything, it teaches that such worship materializes and debases the human mind, gives most unworthy views of God, and in the case of the vast majority leads to a fetishism which in principle is identical with that of the most barbarous tribes. Till India rises above this idolatry, she will never have her proper place in the world." Which deity, idol, do you think the British objected to most? Krishna. Right? In the words of British Supreme Court Judge Sir Joseph Arnold, quote, "It is Krishna, the darling of 16,000 gopis. Krishna, the love hero, who tinges the whole system with the strain of carnal sensualism and strange transcendental lewdness." All right. Next slide, please. Here's a quote from Reverend Alexander Duff. This is a typical attitude of all the systems of false religion ever fabricated by the perverse ingenuity of fallen man. Hinduism is surely the most stupendous. Right? Now, here's the dilemma, right? Bhakti culture, Vaishnava culture was in complete disrespect. It was ready to fall off the edge of a precipice, you're right. It was all but lost after Mahaprabhu left in 1532. And truth be told, the British were responding not to the true, pure Vaishnava culture. They were responding to the Sahajis, the Ganja smokers, not the high philosophy of the Goswamis. So everything about the culture was really misunderstood. Next slide, please. And the intellectuals, the Hindu intellectuals for their part, had no interest in trying to defend Krishna worship. Here's Swami Vivekananda. Images, crosses, and crescents are simply so many symbols to hang spiritual ideas on. Idolatry in India does not mean anything horrible. It is the attempt of undeveloped minds to grasp high spiritual truths. This is called condemning with faint praise, right? So the idea being, instead of actually going inside Krishna consciousness, bhakti culture, and understanding that the deity is not an idol, but an actual avatar of God, let's just strip away from India everything that the European intellectuals find objectionable. We will earn our place at the seat of the table of the world by getting rid of all of the parts that the rest of the world finds strange and objectionable. Let's have the next slide, please. So here you have first Vice President of independent India, S. Radhakrishnan, whom Prabhupada quoted, by the way, in the early days when we didn't have his Gita yet. From the 9th chapter of the Gita, be mindful of me with love offered to me, sacrificing for me, acting out of reverence for me, surely you shall come to me. Radhakrishnan comments, it is not the personal Krishna to whom we have to give ourselves up utterly, but the unborn, beginningless, eternal, who speaks through Krishna. Prabhupada quoted this in the early days, 66, 67, as saying, this proves that Radhakrishnan was an impersonalist. Now, in the book, brazen product placement, once again, you will find the story where Dr. Radhakrishnan actually helped Srila Prabhupada to get his visa to America. Prabhupada visited him and said, I'm trying to get to the West. If I had a letter of recommendation from you, I'd be able to get my visa much easier. And Radhakrishnan, it's empty. Radhakrishnan said to Srila Prabhupada, well, what good would it do going to the West? I mean, what religion was not high on the list of Indian exports for the vice president? And Prabhupada said, you're not speaking well. Yeah, you may be the head of the country, but you should become like Valmiki and spread the chanting and become reformed like Narada reformed Valmiki. You should reform the lower elements of society. So the vice president says to Prabhupada, I'll tell you what, go speak in the prisons. And if you can show me that your preaching does any good, I'll give you your letter of recommendation. And Prabhupada did. In 63, 64, he taught Bhagavad Gita in some of the Delhi prisons. And the warden of the prisons issued a letter saying, this gentleman has had a really healing, positive effect on the inmates of my prisons. And Radhakrishnan was true to his word, and he gave Prabhupada a letter of recommendation. That's part of how Prabhupada was able to get his visa to come to America. So even though he had a debt of gratitude to Radhakrishnan, he certainly didn't agree with his interpretation of Bhagavad Gita. Any attempt on the part of the general population of India at this time to achieve national independence was put down violently by the British. I mean, the Indian people are saying, we're seeing what's happening in the rest of the world. There's a lot of good material progress being made out there. We want our share too. So independence for them meant the independence to be like the West. The British at this point is still suppressing them. Along comes Gandhi. Next slide, please. One more? Yeah. Along comes Gandhi and says, first we'll get rid of the British, right? Then we'll get our act together as a nation, and then we'll bring our message of spirituality to the world. So into this moment when devotion to Krishna is teetering on the brink of extinction, next slide, please, appears this young child, Abhay Charan. his father, Gaur Mohan, is an Orthodox Vaishnava who is determined that his son will succumb neither to the materialistic influence of the West nor the impersonal distortions of the Indian intelligentsia, but would grow up to be a true Radha Krishna Vaishnava. Right? So from outward appearances, Abhay Charan was destined to lead the life of a comfortable middle-class Gaudiya Vaishnava. Now comes, in that monomyth model, what we would call the call to adventure. In 1922, he meets his spiritual master, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Goswami Maharaj, who gives him his life mission. You go to the West and you bring the real message, the true message of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu to the Western world. And so here, for the first time in Srila Prabhupada's life, is this vision of a broader application to the culture that is his by birth. What he was brought up in, all of a sudden, has an application that he had not seen before. That was what Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati gifted to Srila Prabhupada, was a sense of how this is a global idea. This is not just something for India. And by comparison, Gandhi's idea of liberating India paled. It was minute. It was insignificant. Not India, but the whole world needed liberating from their illusion. So from that very first meeting, Prabhupada is catching fire. And in one letter to a godbrother, he wrote, "It was in that first darshan of my Guru Maharaj that I learned to love." Isn't that a beautiful thing? He said, I understood what love was also in that moment. All of this, by the way, is there. It's in the letters books, it's in the conversation books. Next slide, please. Part of what made Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati so appealing, so attractive to Srila Prabhupada, is that he was a revolutionary. He was absolutely prepared to set aside all social conventions if it supported the work of bringing this message to the world. So he did things that no sannyasi had ever done before. He wore a watch, which was considered, ostentatious. He drove in cars, which was breaking a ban, on moving about in mechanized vehicles. He sent disciples across the ocean, the dark seas, which was also forbidden. The point being that, who could exist going into those heathen cultures? You'd lose your spiritual life. He opened centers in major cities instead of forest ashrams. He built huge pandal programs, huge, spread over dozens of acres with big tents that could house tens of thousands of people. And he showed displays of innovations in medicine and science and education. And then when he had captured everyone's attention, he brought them into a tent where the whole thing was Krishna. Dioramas of Krishna Lila, objects and artifacts, books from the old acharyas and so on. So he would use that device. So the more I'm studying to write this book, the more I'm realizing how much of Srila Prabhupada's movement was inspired by what he learned from his spiritual master inside the Gaudiya Math. Srila Prabhupada was 1,000% surrendered to his spiritual master. Everything from the songs we sing in the morning, to the menu of prasadam, to the programs that we have, everything was inspired by his spiritual master. Next slide, please. Here you see a picture in 1935. This is a gathering of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Goswami's disciples just returning from Europe. They had not had much impact, and Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati had spent huge sums of money to send them there, and he was disappointed. And just days before he passed away, he reiterated his request to his disciple, "You please take this up and you go to the West." By the way, on the right-hand side of this image, if you had not recognized him, that's Srila Prabhupada there. And Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Goswami Maharaj passes away January 1st, 1937. And now we come to what Campbell might have called the road of trials. At this time, Abhay Babu, Bhakti Vedanta, as he was now soon to be called, is contending with a family that does not share his enthusiasm for a world mission. For the book, I had the opportunity to interview Prabhupada's son, Vrindavan Chandra Day, and he was very candid with me. He said, my siblings never really reconciled with the fact that our father was, going to leave for America. Our mother wasn't expecting to marry a world preacher when she got married. And by the way, Srila Prabhupada's wife was a great devotee as well. She was an initiate. She was initiated into the Gaudiya Math. I don't know whether everyone knows that, but she didn't have the same kind of missionary zeal that her husband had, but she was also a devout Krishna worshiper. So, this kind of cliche of, selling biscuits or whatever, we have to be careful. And so Vrindavan Chandra's describing for me what it was like for him. And he was there when Prabhupada got on the Jaladuta to come west. I'll tell you about that in a second. So here's Srila Prabhupada having to contend with a family that is not supportive of his devotional plans. He's trying to do business and it's not working. There's, for no fault of his own, his business plans are failing for one reason or another. He tries to get something started in India. And what is the thinking here? The thinking is, who goes to the West without money? Who goes to America without any resources? How am I going to do that? So he's trying desperately to get something together in India before he leaves for the West, and it's just not working. Well, now we have the part of the road of trials is that he's realizing in dreams, Srila Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati is coming to him and saying, stop, just stop all this. Now you take sannyas. You just depend fully on Krishna. Next slide. Next slide. Thank you. Okay. And sannyas is social suicide. This is the no turning back here. Life is permanently altered, and now Prabhupada begins to work feverishly, and he says, okay, well, I'm not making any money, and I'm a sannyasi, so I'm not supposed to do that anyway, so let me dedicate myself to books. Let me at least get some books going. And the description in the biography of this section of Prabhupada preparing to the West, I'm particularly proud of, because I'm hoping that for a general readership, it'll get across how difficult this was, the immense sacrifices that Prabhupada made to get these first books done. It's somewhat mind-boggling when you read some of the details of how that happened and what he had to go through. There's his typewriter, by the way, in the upper right slide. He finally earned enough money to buy this this typewriter is one of those first generation, you have to practically pound on the keys to get anything out. So very, very austere conditions. Finally, he gets those first 3 books published. By the way, Sumati Morarji, whom you see here, who gave Prabhupada his ticket, she was head of the India Steamship Lines, had actually met Prabhupada previously. She had met him at Kurukshetra on a pilgrimage. Prabhupada was there, and she saw him chanting japa beneath a tree. And at that time, she went to him and asked for his blessings. And when Prabhupada approached her for funding the 3rd volume of first canto, Srimad Bhagavatam, she remembered, she said, I've met you before. I've met you at Kurukshetra, and yes, I will help you with your books. So when those 3 books were finally published and Prabhupada was ready to go, he approaches her again, and at first she refused. She said, I'm not going to give you a ticket to the West. You're going to die. You can't. How are you going to live over there with those crazy people? And he said, no, Krishna will protect me. You'll see. Don't worry. It's okay. She said, okay, I'm going to give you, but it's a round-trip ticket. And I expect to see you back here soon. Next slide. So, the story is well known, that he suffered 2 heart attacks on the way. You might call that the belly of the whale. There's certainly no turning back now. And he arrives in New York. You know the details of the story. He's alone, he has no contacts, he has no money, he's got nothing. And I love this one story of him sitting there in the winter of 1965, which was the coldest winter in the past half century in New York. Freezing cold. And he's sitting in the park, with this, his sponsors in Butler, Pennsylvania, had given him this one overcoat. So he was wearing an overcoat, but he had, a flimsy dhoti and these rubber shoes, and he's sitting there chanting japa, and a man comes, sits down, and kind of looks him over, and a little concerned about how poorly he's dressed against the elements, and says, I'm a postal worker. What's your story? And Prabhupada says, well, I have temples around the world and many disciples around the world. The man saying, you have these things now? He says, well, in time. I'm a patient man. So the man says, so you're on your own here? And Prabhupada shows him his beads and says, I'm never alone. I'm never alone. And he had that vision of what would be even before he left for the West. There's a discussion that took place among Brijbasis before Prabhupada left. And they were making fun of him, saying, why are you harboring this dream? Why do you keep thinking about going to the Western world? It's crazy. Prabhupada said, no, there are temples, there are books, there are disciples. So he was always talking about that. He had the firm conviction that this was going to happen. So over the next 12 years, of course, things exploded. But in those early days, next slide, please. This early generation of devotees, by the way, were not hippies in the San Francisco sense of hippies. New York hippies did not wear flowers in their hair. New York hippies were intellectual activists who were ready to take to the streets for a worthy cause. And when they met Prabhupada, what attracted them was the philosophy. Here's a teacher who's teaching something. Now, there had been a few other, Indian teachers in New York, but none of them quoted full Sanskrit verses. None of them had a comprehensive vision of what the spiritual journey is all about. So those first disciples, don't get this idea that they were a bunch of, stoners or something. That this was a very intellectual group of young people in those days. Next slide, please. Then he moves to Los Angeles. Those early Mukunda and his then wife Janaki meet up with their old college buddies Shamsundar and Malati. They head to L.A., to San Francisco. They start a temple there. Things begin to grow. Prabhupada arrives. There's a mantra rock concert, which is an amazing story. And then devotees say, let's do like they did in New York and let's take to the streets. And here you see, I had to get a picture of Tamal and Jamuna and some of those other, Mukunda there on the left. I couldn't resist getting a picture of them in there. Next slide, please. So we might describe the achieving the boon in Prabhupada's case as achieving the book. I mean, he would work every night, get up 2 o'clock in the morning and write and write and write and write, because he knew that this would last. And in my last time with him in Bhubaneswar in 1977, he commented to me, he said, when people see the books, they'll know that Krishna consciousness is here to stay. And indirectly what he was saying was, I'm not going to last much longer. This was January of 1977 in Bhubaneswar. But he said the books will last. The books will survive. They'll survive me. There's, of course, this one chapter in the biography that I could not resist putting in, and that's the contribution that George Harrison made to Prabhupada's movement. I mean, can you imagine being at the height? George was someone who used to say that he had made it to the top of the material mountain and then looked over and saw how much more there was on the other side. And when he met Prabhupada, he saw the real deal. I mean, as a Beatle, these guys had seen everyone. I mean, every leader in the world, every famous person in the world, you couldn't put anything over on them. And they were very, very quick character studies. They could size you up in a split second and know whether you're there because you're a sincere person or whether you've got some exploitive motive. And if they saw that, they would just walk away. And George met Prabhupada and realized this is the real deal. Next slide, please. He took to Krishna consciousness. Of all the Beatles, he was the one who took spiritual life most seriously. In his home in Friar Park, he had a little altar there with just a photograph of Radha London Ishwara. It's a simple alter. You might say he had no alter ego. And of course, he loved India, loved going to India. Next slide, please. Here he is as Christopher Walken in The Deer Hunter. Okay, note to self, don't use the Deer Hunter joke. Okay, next slide, please. And then, of course, he said, we've got to give back. So, I mean, he was very excited. He wanted spiritual life to make a practical difference in the world. So he wanted to do something, and he said, let's use the music. So in December of '69, recording the Hare Krishna mantra, and then when I showed up in London, shortly thereafter, we were recording the Radha Krishna Temple album. And just to give you an idea of how seriously George took his Krishna consciousness, I want to play this little clip for you.
Hare Krishna. My sweet Lord, my Lord, my sweet Lord.
They say, past has gone, thou canst not that recall. Future is not, may not be at all. Present is, the only thing that exists is really the now. Everything is changing all the time. We get born and we die. But we are in this body and we go through from birth to death. We stay the same. The soul is the same, but the body is changing. Krishna said, there's no time when we didn't exist, and there'll be no time when we cease to exist. The only thing that changes is the body. I was at a point where I needed something that was real, because most stuff in this world isn't real. And it's, it's not lasting. And I wanted something that would give me, hook me into something, some reality. Really was the key that opened the door into the yoga and the yogic philosophy and the Vedic scriptures, which is really the foundation of everything. It gave some sort of backbone to my life. I could write hundreds of songs, hey baby, what you gonna do? That I could churn them out, but I don't want to. If I'm gonna say something, I'd like it to have some kind of importance, some value, so that, in 20 years' time, it's not just some dumb song that made, some royalties. I mean, the royalties are nice, but it would be good to be able to have something a little deeper.
Next slide, please. George contributed $18,000 to print the Krishna book, and that was a game changer. When we had the Krishna book, there was something of real substance and beauty to provide people. And someday, if you haven't heard Rameshwar Prabhu tell the story, it's absolutely a breathtaking description of how the Krishna consciousness movement was built, starting with the Christmas Marathon right here in Los Angeles in the early 70s, and how big books became the foundation for creating an income that was used to build temples and buy properties around the world. And that was George's credit, that he, $18,000 back then was a lot of money. And next slide, please. I found this illustration. Not yet, that one. Is that next? You can go back one. Yeah, I found this illustration in Old Back to Godhead. If you can see down there in the bottom, in 1966, it says 1,000 books and magazines. And it kind of goes up each year. So in the course of the story, we're up around maybe 1973. Now the number of books and magazines jumps to 8 million. And there's a big question mark there after 78. Not quite sure where things are going to go. All right, now if you'd go to the next slide, please. So the return to the ordinary world in the monomyth chronology might be compared with the time that Prabhupada brought disciples back to India. That's an absolutely breathtaking moment as well in the story, because if you can imagine for a moment, chanting Hare Krishna here in the West, we were always the object of derision and ridicule. In India, the devotees were glorified for chanting Hare Krishna. How's that for a change of tune? Right? Invaders had been going into India for thousands of years just looking to exploit the country. Here are Westerners coming with the utmost of respect for Indian culture and religion and spirituality. And it was absolutely breathtaking for India to see how the culture that had been maligned for so long was now being taken up in the West. So here was Prabhupada's great strategy. If India is so enamored of Western imports, let's have them import Krishna, courtesy of the United States. And then if you go to the next slide, please, there was an acknowledgement by Srila Prabhupada's godbrothers that he had fulfilled the desire of their spiritual master, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Goswami Maharaj, to bring Krishna consciousness to the West. And now just jumping forward a little bit, because I'd like to leave the rest of the time we have together for discussion and your comments and thoughts. There was a moment when everything hung in the balance. In the mid-1970s, a movement began among parents of young people who had been indoctrinated into different kinds of religious communities, sects, cults, countercultural groups, farms, ashrams, you name it. And it was called deprogramming. And the father of the deprogramming movement was a man named Ted Patrick, whose own son, by the way, had been indoctrinated into one of these sects. So he had a personal motive for wanting to help parents get their children back from these spurious groups. Because devotees were so visibly prominent on the streets of America, they were often at the top of the deprogrammers' hit list. So ultimately it led to a trial, a court case in New York brought against leaders of the New York Temple on charges of brainwashing. The charge by the prosecution was that Krishna consciousness is a cult, it's a sect that forces its members to give up their worldly goods, to chant this thing repeatedly every day, to become vegetarian, and sleep on the floor, all of these horrible things that they depicted that devotees do. And it went all the way up to the Supreme Court of the state of New York. Prabhupada rallied. By this time, his energies were waning. He was not in good health at all by this time. And yet he rallied. Harisori Prabhu described for me that he had not seen this much energy from Srila Prabhupada in a very, very long time. And Prabhupada said, now it has come to this. In the beginning, they will ignore us. Then they will make fun of us, and now they are attacking us because they see that we're serious and we're growing. So we must rally our forces and defend Krishna consciousness. And he instructed disciples to go out and get letters of recommendation, get the scholars, the Indian community to vouch for the Krishna consciousness movement. And he was a military general leading a campaign from his deathbed in Vrindavan. And when the decision was made, how shall we conduct our appearance in court? Should we wear karmi clothes? No. He said, shaved head, robes, and bring in all my books. And our defense position will be that they first have to read all of my books. Then they can decide whether this is a real process or not. And so Adi Keshava, at the time, Adi Keshava Swami, was wheeling into the courtroom, shaved head, tilak, robes, danda. He's wheeling all of Prabhupada's books into the courtroom. Finally, it was up to the judge to deliberate, and the decision was arrived at. Next slide, please. In March of 1977, judge dismisses charges in Hare Krishna brainwashing case, and he ruled that Krishna consciousness is a bona fide religion with its roots going back thousands of years in Indian history. And when Prabhupada heard this, and it was Tamal Krishna who ran into his room with a copy of the paper. It was the Times of India that was reprinting an article from the New York Times, and he held it up and said, Prabhupada! And he read the article to Prabhupada, and Prabhupada thought for a moment, and he said, now my mission is fulfilled. He had come for this purpose. All right. Remember that this culture had been on the brink of extinction. Maligned, put down, made fun of, marginalized, made the brunt of stand-up comedian humor. And finally, when the Supreme Court says, no, this is real, he had done what his spiritual master had asked him to do, and that is to establish the authenticity of Krishna consciousness in the West. Of course, the irony here is that Prabhupada insisted that Krishna consciousness is not a religion, that is the original condition of the soul. But he understood the strategic value of first establishing Krishna consciousness as a valid religion so that we could explain the higher principles of Bhagavad Gita and Srimad Bhagavatam. Then, I'm sorry if this is a little disturbing, but I felt compelled to put this in because this was one of the most extraordinary moments in the history of humanity. Srila Prabhupada is so merged into the ecstasy of finishing his translation of Srimad Bhagavatam that on his deathbed he's continuing to translate and comment the 10th canto. And that moment is described as well in the book. Next slide, please. There's an additional step to this hero journey that's, you might call it the resurrection. The court case challenged the legitimacy of the teachings. There have been court cases before, for example, the constitutionality of distributing books in airports, but this was the first time that everything was on the line. And when that was won, and Srila Prabhupada passed away, having achieved his mission, having achieved the boon and having brought the boon back into the world, the expansion of that achievement is through his followers and disciples. In other words, his passing was not the end, but the beginning. Just the beginning. And the message is there, and the mission is there, and the work that's being done with such heart and soul by the leaders of our society. Next slide, please. It's there in the work that our dear godbrother Shonak Rishi on the left is doing at the Oxford Center for Hindu Studies, where he is reversing hundreds of years of misunderstanding and misimpressions about Vaishnava culture through a PhD program under the auspices of Oxford University. Can I have the next slide, please? It was there in the work of our beloved late godbrother Bhakti Tirtha Maharaj, who had dedicated his life to the African and African American communities, and had done such a marvelous job that he was appointed chief of an African tribe. Next slide, please. It's there in the eco-village and other alternative energy source and environmentally friendly projects that are being spearheaded by Prabhupada's disciples around the world. Next slide, please. We have our first congressperson, Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard from Hawaii, is